The bell at the town hall has already rung for evening service, but the shopkeepers are in no hurry to close up. Near the meat counter, the argument dies down as abruptly as a candle extinguished by the wind. A moment ago, the shopkeeper was haggling over a ham, but now he stands with a knife clenched in his hand, looking over the heads of the crowd at the neighboring house. A woman in a simple cloak hurriedly carries a basket along the wooden gallery. Someone whispers that they saw her at someone else's doorstep at night. Someone adds that her husband was away at the time. Someone else is almost certain that she didn't just visit, but did something that would make even old women blush. In a couple of weeks, the town clerk will neatly write in the book of fines that such and such a husband and such a wife paid a certain amount for insulting the honor of the house and promised to leave the neighborhood. The argument at the counter will fade from memory, but the entry in the book will remain. Rumor turns into judgment with a stroke of the pen. This is the power of family honor in the Middle Ages and early modern times. What began as a retelling, a joke, a snippet of gossip at the market, could end in real money, loss of craft, exile, or divorce. In the familiar myths about the past, this reality is almost always lost. We are told either about holy times, when everyone supposedly lived by divine laws and was immediately punished with death for any trifle, or about endless debauchery, when knights and nuns did nothing but break the rules. Both pictures are convenient, both are effective, but they do not quite match what can be read in city ordinances, church statutes, marriage contracts, and books of fines. Behind the dry formulas of insult, shame, and suspicion of immorality lay not abstract moralizing, but a very concrete economy of the body and reputation. The family in the cities of Latin Europe was perceived as a small business, an investment, and a project all at once. The honor of the home was as much a resource as a shop, tools, or a house on the main street. It provided credit, access to marriage with suitable partners, the opportunity to join a guild, and the hope of a profitable apprenticeship for adult children. If this honor began to crack in the conversations of neighbors, plans for the future began to crumble along with it. Official norms constantly reminded people of this. The statutes of Italian cities, the charters of German and Flemish guilds, and French ordinances on morality all repeated the same idea. The honor of the family does not belong to one person. A married townswoman could, through her behavior, undermine not only her husband's authority, but also the financial prospects of his brothers. A young craftsman, suspected of indecent relations, risked not only his own reputation, but also the business of the entire workshop where his adult relatives worked. Behind this were not only the words of priests, but also very specific legal mechanisms. In the city's books of fines, some pages are almost entirely devoted to punishments for violence, theft, and debt. But between them, like thick, dark stripes, are records of words. For an insult, equated with an accusation of debauchery, the fine could be comparable to several months' earnings. Sometimes it was supplemented by nights in prison, sometimes by temporary expulsion from the city, sometimes by an obligation to publicly admit that the words were untrue. A person might think that they had simply let something slip in an argument, but the court saw this as damage to the entire house and neighborhood, where people would now fear the unclean family. This is where the myth of total debauchery begins to crumble. It is easy to say that in the cities of the late Middle Ages, no one paid attention to rumors, and everyone lived as they pleased. But the records show the opposite. Dozens of adults, from neighbors to relatives, were ready to go to court and spend hours recounting who saw whom and when, what gestures they considered unacceptable, and what late visits seemed suspicious. Private life did not disappear, but it was constantly at risk of becoming the subject of collective interrogation. At the same time, the opposite myth, about immediate death penalties for any stain, does not stand up well to comparison with the documents. In vivid legends, Nobles allegedly walled up their daughters, merchants threw their wives from towers without hesitation, and monasteries were turned into small torture chambers for the fallen. These stories were actively rewritten by later moralists, novelists, and popular compilers of horrors of old times. But in real court records, other punishments are much more common. Long lists of fines, prescriptions, acts of reconciliation, and agreements on separate living arrangements. The bloody ending that people love to talk about in fictional stories was a rare exception, and, as a rule, was associated with politics or property wars within the elite. An ordinary urban family was much more likely to face prolonged, exhausting pressure than a swift execution. Nevertheless, the very possibility of such a deadly outcome lived in people's imaginations. Preachers loved to cite examples of fathers who did not spare their own blood for the sake of honor. Chroniclers sometimes retold stories about judges who allegedly preferred to execute their own daughters rather than allow dishonor to befall their families. Contemporaries may not have known whether this actually happened, but they felt that people were willing to sacrifice a human being to protect the reputation of their family. That is why even a hint of disgrace was taken so seriously. Behind it stood not only the amount of the fine, but also the fragile image of what relatives and authorities were capable of. The system in which rumor became legal fact was served by city and church courts. Each had its own instruments. City magistrates took care of order on the streets and the protection of property rights, but gradually took control of the behavior of residents as well. The statutes of German and Swiss cities in the late Middle Ages contain separate sections on abuses against honor and moral order. They list not only fights and gross insults, but also night gatherings, suspicious visits, and noisy feasts, which were seen as a threat to the stability of the neighborhood. Church courts, especially in large episcopal centers, and after the reform of marriage law, became the main place where family honor was discussed. There were fewer purely spiritual issues than one might expect. Much more often, the issues were marriage promises, broken engagements, suspicions of infidelity, disputes over dowries, and the legality of the union. The parish community lived on rumors. If adult neighbors believed that the groom had deceived the bride by promising marriage and then disappearing, they could persuade relatives to file a lawsuit in the ecclesiastical court. If an adult husband was convinced that his wife had brought shame upon him, he sought not only moral justification, but also a legal opportunity to get rid of her without losing his property. In these trials, the human body was considered as a field of evidence, but not in naturalistic detail, but through indirect signs. Doctors and midwives were sometimes called in as experts, but more often than not, judges relied on the testimony of adult witnesses and documents. They could discuss whether neighbors had seen the couple together too late at night, whether they had slept under the same roof without the consent of their relatives, or whether they had appeared together at celebrations contrary to the norm. They might wonder whether the story of a sudden illness, which caused the wedding ceremony to be postponed time and time again, was plausible. Each such fact was recorded in the documents, where the calm bureaucratic language concealed the fear and shame of real people. The reality of the situation was much more mundane and economically motivated than the grandiose myths about holy times. When the ecclesiastical court dealt with an adult couple whose relationship caused a scandal, it rarely sought the maximum punishment. It was much more important to fit the situation back into an understandable system. If the union could be legalized, especially with a dowry and the support of both families, the judges were inclined to do so. If the reputation of one of the spouses was already beyond repair, a compromise was sought. Separate living arrangements were allowed, but part of the property was assigned to them so as not to push them into poverty and crime. In the most difficult cases, the church authorities referred the case to a secular court, but even then, there was still hope for a peaceful solution. City magistrates were not interested in mass executions. They needed living taxpayers and craftsmen. At this point, a second important twist in the myth versus document narrative becomes apparent. In popular imagination, the Church supposedly cared exclusively about the spiritual side, ignoring the real consequences for people. The documents, however, show something else. Church courts were, in essence, engaged in social engineering. They regulated marriages and family honor because this kept the community within certain boundaries. Sermons threatened hellish torments and eternal shame, but court decisions much more often dealt with entirely material categories. Who would pay compensation? Whose house would be considered clean? Who was entitled to a dowry? The fear of punishment after death was reinforced by the fear of being left without a means of subsistence tomorrow. At the same time, preachers and moralists actively spread rumors about extreme, almost unbelievable practices. In city squares and in handwritten collections of examples, one can find stories about how in a certain city there was allegedly a secret room where those who disgraced their family were tortured until they renounced all their rights. Or tales of monasteries where adult monks and nuns who broke their vows were prescribed medical procedures that were more like fantasies than real procedures. Such stories were attractive precisely because of their cruelty and detail, although there is almost no documentary evidence to support them. Why were they needed if the courts already had real power? They worked as a tool of propaganda and discipline. A person who has heard stories since childhood about walled-up sinners and sophisticated therapeutic punishments is less inclined to test the limits of what is permissible. Even if in real life everything is limited to restrictions on sacraments, excommunication from the community, or a large fine, the imagination will paint a much more frightening picture. Thus, mythical violence complemented bureaucratic violence. In their imagination, people lived in a world where every step could lead to immediate and brutal punishment, while in reality, in most cases, they faced slow but no less devastating economic and social punishment. The control mechanisms were varied. In Italian communes, there were special magistrates appointed to monitor morals. In German cities, there were courts dealing with cases of excessive luxury and debauchery. In some French and Swiss parishes, parish meetings effectively turned into tribunals of reputation. Clothing, participation in holidays, visits to baths, visits to other people's homes, even the choice of route to the market. All of this could become a topic of discussion. Women who appeared on the streets in the evening without being accompanied by adult relatives came under close scrutiny. Men who spent too much time in taverns and frequently changed company risked being labeled unreliable. Each such symptom was considered not in isolation, but in relation to the honor of the family. Against this backdrop, marriage contracts appear to be an attempt to preemptively record everything that could become a source of conflict. They specified the size of the dowry, living conditions, property rights, and the order of inheritance. However, there was always another condition between the lines. The future union must strengthen, not destroy, the honor of both parties. If, years later, rumors began to circulate that one of the spouses was behaving as if they had forgotten this unspoken clause, the contract became a weapon. Relatives could claim that they had been deceived, married off to a person whose flaws had been concealed. They demanded a revision of the terms, the return of part of the dowry, and the dissolution of the union. Acts of reconciliation supplemented this arsenal. When the conflict reached a boiling point, city or church authorities often pushed the parties not toward a final breakup, but toward an official peace. The document recorded who accused whom, what words were considered offensive, and what damages were estimated in monetary terms. This was followed by a list of obligations. One side apologizes, the other pays compensation, and both agree to forget old grievances and not to mention them publicly. Sometimes the act required the guilty party to leave the neighborhood or city for a certain period of time. In this logic, the honor of the family was perceived as a fabric with a tear. It cannot be completely restored, but one can try to hide the damage until the fabric unravels further. What seems particularly cruel is the fact that in such cases, the personal and the collective were invariably mixed together. An adult could sincerely believe that his private life was nobody's business, but in the eyes of relatives and neighbors, he was part of a common project. A father who had invested all his savings in his daughter's dowry perceived any stain on her reputation as a threat to his own survival in old age. Brothers saw their sister's good name as a guarantee of their future marriages. In cities where craft workshops were passed down from generation to generation, the odious actions of one family member could close the door to the workshop for others. This created pressure in which the choices of an adult were constantly evaluated through the prism of the gains and losses of the entire family. In many ways, this logic explains cases where the family itself initiated the persecution of one of its members. From a modern perspective, this looks like betrayal. Parents or brothers who support the punishment of a loved one. But if you look at it through the eyes of the era, you see something else. In conditions of weak social guarantees and strict property boundaries, relatives saw one disgraceful person as a threat to everyone. Complaints against spouses and relatives contain phrases about there being no other way to preserve the home and name. They sound like an attempt to justify participating in the destruction of one's own family for the sake of its salvation. Doctors and scholars, it would seem, should have mitigated this picture with rational arguments. But most medical ideas about the body in the late Middle Ages and early modern period tended to increase anxiety. Theories that excessive or wrong passions harm not only the soul, but also the body, led to the conclusion that reputation is a matter of health. This was especially true for women's bodies. They were described as more porous, susceptible to external influences, dependent on the balance of fluids and conditions. From there, it was a short step to the assertion that disgrace, shame, and rumors could literally taint the body and be passed on to children. Even if such ideas remained at the level of treatises, they fed existing fears and gave them a pseudo-scientific basis. Monastic rules added another layer to this. The lives of adult monks and nuns were regulated with obsessive attention. When they could talk, how they should look, which route they should take when walking around the courtyard. Violations related to the body and intimacy were considered not only a personal sin, but also a stain on the entire community. Internal acts punished offenders with deprivation of communal meals, hard labor, and sometimes transfer to another house. Stories about secret cells and sophisticated punishments, which were later used to frighten the public, find almost no direct confirmation in these documents. But they fit perfectly into the image of strict walls, where something terrifying is supposedly hidden behind every door, and they live on in the imagination to this day. This brings us to the third twist in the myth versus document narrative. Real practice often turns out to be no less cruel, but in a different way. Instead of theatrical executions, there is a long, drawn-out social death. Instead of mysterious rituals, there are endless meetings, witness interrogations, mounting fines, and the inability to find a new job or get married. The myth promises one vivid, terrifying episode, after which the end comes. The documents show a life in which punishment can drag on for years. An adult who has once found themselves in the role of a disgrace to their family is forced to live in a city where every movement, every glance, reminds them of their past deeds. Against this backdrop, it is particularly clear how the means of control were distributed among different institutions. Ecclesiastical courts controlled marriages and sexual morality. City authorities controlled order and property, and families controlled the behavior of their adult members. But when it came to matters of honor, These three levels almost always converged. A priest could tell another scary story about the price of dishonor in his sermon. A magistrate could remind people at a meeting about new fines for insulting chastity. Relatives could give someone a choice: obey or be excluded from the family circle. People lived at the intersection of these demands, trying to find space for their bodies and personal lives where there was almost none left. Not everyone, of course, accepted this. The history of the sources also preserves another dimension: strategies for circumvention. Some adult couples formalized their relationships through private agreements and presented the courts with the fait accompli of their already established lives. Others took advantage of the imperfections in communication between different levels of authority. What was forgiven in one parish did not necessarily become known in another. Some moved to a neighboring town, started a new life under a different name, and gradually cleared their reputation, relying on a new community that knew nothing of the old rumors. The records of city councils sometimes contain decisions to accept outsiders, with the proviso that old cases would not be discussed as long as the new residents behaved impeccably. There were also more subtle ways of resistance. In some cases, relatives deliberately downplayed the significance of rumors, refusing to take them to court, even though they could formally do so. In others, they supported the independent choices of their adult daughters and sons, even if this threatened to violate the expectations of their neighbors. In letters, which are sometimes miraculously preserved in archives, one can find cautiously worded hopes that times will change, that new rulers or new customs will soften the rules. These voices express not only fear, but also a stubborn desire to preserve at least some personal freedom. At the same time, the mechanisms of control themselves did not disappear over time, but changed. Later, with the strengthening of monarchies and the growth of bureaucracy, the state became more and more involved in regulating family honor. More detailed codes appeared, in which divorce, separate living, illegitimacy, and inheritance were prescribed with pedantic precision. Church courts gave way to secular ones in some places, while in others they continued to operate in parallel. The forms of punishment became more standardized, but the essence remained the same. Rumors, fueled by sermons, street gossip, and family panic, turned into cases, cases turned into verdicts, and verdicts turned into long-term changes in people's lives. On an everyday level, it looked as mundane and frightening as the evening at the butcher's shop at the beginning of our story. Adults discussed their neighbors, not only out of idle curiosity, but also out of fear of being associated with those whose honor was in question. A merchant might choose not to rent a room to a family about whom rumors were circulating. A master craftsman might refuse to take on an adult apprentice with a questionable past, fearing for the reputation of his workshop. A woman might refuse to be friends with a neighbor who was the subject of gossip, so as not to tarnish her own honor. Thus, vague, difficult-to-verify rumors became solid social facts, and people's flesh became a field through which economic and political interests ran. Closer to modern times, new myths appeared, this time about the Middle Ages itself. Enlightenment authors liked to portray past centuries as a continuous nightmare of cruelty and superstition. 19th century novelists delight in depicting scenes of spontaneous reprisals in the name of honor, where the crowd immediately throws another disgraced woman from the tower. In these pictures, the church appears as an unambiguous ally of cruelty. This image is convenient. Against its backdrop, the present day almost automatically looks more humane. But the documents resist this pattern as well. They show not a black and white world, but a complex system of pressure and reservations, where the same institutions could both destroy lives and sometimes protect people from the arbitrariness of others. As a result, the history of family honor in medieval and early modern cities turns out to be not so much a story of isolated horrific executions as a story of how an entire world was built around a fragile resource: reputation. It was distributed unevenly, attached to gender, name, craft, and membership in a particular community. It could be slightly strengthened by good deeds, a pious life, generosity, and very quickly lost because of a single rumor. This resource was overshadowed by the church, the city, and the family, each with its own interests, but all together forming a system in which the human body was the least of a person's personal affairs. When we look at this world from today's perspective, it is especially tempting to separate ourselves from it with a wall of time, to say that such practices remained in the distant, dark ages. But if we listen to the mechanics rather than the old words, the picture becomes disturbingly familiar. Rumor, reinforced by authority, becomes quasi-proven fact. The fact is enshrined in a document or a public decision. A person's life changes as if this rumor were true. The only difference is that instead of a town clerk, today it may be another authority. Instead of a book of fines, it may be another register. Instead of a sermon, it may be another channel for spreading scary stories about what happens to those who disgrace their family, community, or country. In medieval and early modern cities, family honor was indeed a sentence. Sometimes it was a saving one, when courts and statutes protected the weak from arbitrariness, because an attack on them was considered an attack on the entire family. Sometimes it was destructive, when the same principle justified expulsion, divorce, and prolonged humiliation. Between the myth of holy times and a set of dry records on parchment lies a whole human life, full of fear, calculations, compromises, and attempts to survive in a world where your body and your personal life were part of someone else's account. And this, perhaps, is the main lesson of this story. The most frightening thing is not the rare extremes that chronicles and novels like to scare us with, but the everyday, almost invisible machine of control that year after year turns other people's words into your destiny.